up on Dialogue Weekend. Closures of consulates in Houston and Chengdu as tensions rise. Is there still room to bring relations back on track? Good news on COVID-19 vaccines. The WHO says several are now in phase 3 trials and showing promise. And this week's Newsmaker. Now on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to Dialogue Weekend. I'm Chengdu. The U.S. abruptly asked China to close its consulate in Houston in a matter of 72 hours. In response, China asked the U.S. to shut down its consulate in Chengdu. Many say it's the lowest point in the world's most important bilateral relationship since they established the ties 40 years ago. Yet many are deeply worried that the China-U.S. relations could get even worse during the time running up to November's presidential election in the U.S. Joining me to discuss the challenges facing the two countries are Professor Chen Hong from East China Normal University and Richard Chesney, professorial lecturer in the Department of Political Science at George Washington University. So welcome to the show, gentlemen. So tensions between China and the U.S. have been there for some time. Richard, starting from trade conflicts to technology, media, visa issue, etc. But the U.S. order to close the Chinese consulate in Houston came as a surprise for many. So what are the reasons behind it? Are you surprised by the move?
Well, the accusations are that the Chinese government has been engaged in espionage and spying, and specifically in the case of the Houston consulate, something called the Thousand Talents Program, which, according to the U.S. government, sort of crossed the line in terms of the research sponsorship that the Chinese government has given to those that are working in its interests. So that was one of the reasons that Houston was picked. And, but this comes within the context of a whole host of interdependencies in this very complex long-run relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And we have to see this within the context of both that relationship and, I think, the relationship between domestic politics and international politics in both countries.
Professor Chen Hong, so in terms of the shutting down of the Chinese consulate in Houston, why now? How much does it have to do with, say, U.S. Domestic politics? I mean, election upcoming, right?
Yeah, I think this is actually an indication of the escalation of the tension between the two countries. As you mentioned, actually, the bilateral relations is reaching its lowest point. Nothing like this has happened, since the two countries established diplomatic relations. So I think actually part of the reason is that actually many people say that actually this is a part of election ploy employed by the Trump administration to distract the public anger against the Trump government's handling or mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the racial protests that is raging across the country. I think that is part of the reason, but the other reason, I think, obviously, is actually a kind of like intensifying campaign on the part of the American administration to suppress, and also to even to crush China's developments, and that has been a consistent aim since Donald Trump took office. That is to stop China from developing, and also to assume a kind of like imagined challenging position that is going to be challenging the U.S. hegemony.
With the big picture of this bilateral relationship, of course, in response to U.S. order, China, asked the U.S. to close its Consulate General in Chengdu in southwestern China. So Professor Chen, again, why Chengdu? We know there are 5 U.S. consulates in the Chinese mainland. Why Chengdu is chosen here?
Well, I think actually it is an indication of the measured response of China's way of responding to the U.S. provocation. I think actually after the Trump administration declared the closure of the Houston consulates, the Chinese consulates in Houston, actually there has been a kind of like a widespread indignation across China, for some kind of retaliatory responses. There have been some, suggestions about, retaliating at the Hong Kong and Macau consulates of the United States, because actually obviously the closure of the Hong Kong and Macau consulates would be a much harder hit on the U.S. than Chengdu or anywhere else. But definitely, obviously, we see a kind of restraint on the part of China, to select Chengdu as their target. On the other hand, of course, Chengdu is located in the southwest of China, which is actually, a concentration of heavy industry and including military industry and also space industry. So definitely, the U.S. government, U.S. consulates definitely have a kind of like interest in collecting materials about such such kind of espionage interest. And of course, Chengdu is also close to Tibet and also Xinjiang. So in other words, there is a kind of like espionage interest on the part of the United States.
Well, both countries obviously have their own consideration behind their latest moves. Also, right after basically the U.S. order to close the Chinese consulate in Houston, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo delivered a speech. Basically said that the engagement policy with China since Nixon administration has failed. So Richard, do you agree with such a rather sweeping judgment, I would say?
No, I don't agree with that. I think that we have to view the relationship between the United States and China within the context of constructive competition. And I think if we deviate from that path, both sides suffer, and the world suffers accordingly. There are a range of issues here that have to be taken into account, including skirmishes with India, including Taiwan, where there have recently been, in the Taiwan Strait, increased naval military exercises. I think what's interesting about the choice to shut down the consulate in Chengdu is that one of the primary responsibilities of staff at that consulate was to monitor nationalist irredentist sentiment in Tibet. And I think that that issue of nationalist irredentist or separatist movements is a much broader issue, which poses some extreme dangers. In many states, in India, for example, some of which are very close to Tibet and Nepal and Myanmar, there have been some profound and lasting political instability due to what are called the Naxals. It's a broader term used to describe groups, many of which have, I believe, some cross ties. And so this has regional implications. And so I think that we have to think about how to stand down from this, because the United States is increasingly becoming an exporter of oil. China is the world's largest importer of oil. The relationship is complex as these superpowers jockey for position in the stage of international proportions. And this is, I think, a function of some of the growing pains of that system. But we've got to be very prudent to clamp down and ensure that these tensions don't escalate out of control.
Mm-hmm. Well, Richard, also, during the speech, Secretary Pompeo also called for other countries, to build an alliance, so-called, like-minded countries, to build an alliance against China. How likely is it? What's the prospect of that suggestion?
Well, one thing that's been bandied about is to resurrect the idea of a Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, among other things, worked to confront the Chinese over intellectual property rights issues and to serve as an economic bulwark in terms of, this is one of the designs of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a bulwark to keep Chinese influence at bay in terms of many states in the region. That's a possibility, but the idea is that I think the United States has and the Chinese government have to understand that there are mutual vulnerabilities on both sides, and that instead of working to exploit those, there should be multilateral efforts on the part of other governments working in conjunction with the Chinese and the Americans in terms of understanding what those vulnerabilities entail policy-wise. So, for example, in the case of China, we see an aging workforce, we see an economic slowdown, we see certain issues in terms there was recent flooding in the central parts of China that President Xi has to deal with. So there are a host of issues that instead of being flashpoints of contention should work within the context of multilateral efforts to assuage some of the fears associated with different political positions.
So a good point. Obviously, countries not only in China and the U.S. should work together, but also involve regional and global powers to work together, for example, to deal with the global pandemic. So, Professor Chen,
yes.
I have a question for you here. Pompeo also made a bit irritating point for Chinese. He called for Chinese people to stand up against the government, against the CPC party over there. So what do you make of that call?
Well, I think actually the Pompeo speech is largely a kind of hate speech. It's full of illogical, empty, and senseless, hate, and spiteful, content. It is actually a declaration of hostility towards China, towards the Chinese way of governance. I think actually the Pompeo's call for the Chinese people to distance themselves from the Chinese government and also the Chinese Communist Party is a way that actually is quite, insidious. That is actually to try to stoke up a kind of like discontent among the Chinese people. I think this is a very irritating scenario in which there's no responsible, government, no head of foreign affairs of any country would be making such a kind of, speech that is full of meanness and spitefulness, devoid of diplomacy, devoid of subtlety, only full of, such a kind of, hostility that is meant to topple the government of another country.
And also,
yes.
it's like a blatant interference of the Chinese internal affairs about how China should be run, how China should be governed or by which party. It's really not the business of the Americans, I would say. And also, you see, like the U.S., some say the U.S. attempt, to change China ultimately will be futile, because if you look at the approval rating of the Chinese government, it's more than 90%, 93%, probably the highest in the world, because they have done a wonderful job over the past 40+ years. There's no reason for Chinese people somehow to change the government. And also, I think, ultimately, it's really the U.S. They needed to make a choice, as said by the Chinese ambassador to Washington, ultimately whether the U.S. is willing to live with a country which has a different culture, which has a different system. What do you make of that?
Yes, I think actually that another part of another motive, I think, for Pompeo to make such speeches is out of his frustration and disappointments in seeing China has been, developing, as you said, and growing, for all those years. And in particular, against the background of handling the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, actually the Chinese government is handling the situation in a much, much better way than Trump and his governments. And this actually has been causing a kind of like almost like jealousy on the part of, Pompeo and also his team. So that actually there is a kind of like a great, strong, spitefulness and meanness towards the Chinese, government in various ways. I think actually definitely, as you said, the United States, the U.S. people is actually they're facing a kind of a prospect of regime change, and that may actually make, hopefully, of course, lead to some kind of a changes of China policy, which will lead to stability and peace of the world.
Well, let's shift to another area we already sort of like mentioned, the global pandemic. Promising study results from 2 candidate COVID-19 vaccines are giving hope that one of them may be available before the end of this year. One of the vaccines in the leading position is being developed by the Chinese company CanSino Biologics, the other by AstraZeneca and Oxford. These 2 are among some 150 candidate vaccines globally. Following the successful trial of the vaccines, we have a challenge, of course, of getting it into the market and, more importantly, the fair distribution of the vaccine around the world, in particular for the developing country. So joining us now is Dr. Mohammed Munir, a virologist and a lecturer in biomedicine at Lancaster University. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So according to the medical journal, The Lancet, 2 COVID-19 vaccine candidates, one from China, the other from the UK, have proven safe for humans and produced strong immune reactions among patients involved in the experiments. So what does that mean in layman's terms? How close are we from, like, say, everybody will get a jab before the end of the year?
Yeah, I think both of these vaccines, those are developed by the AstraZeneca and CanSino Biologicals. They produce very strong antibody responses as well as T-cell responses, and both of these responses are important to govern any resistance against the natural infections. However, the Chinese vaccine trial was a little more weighted, mainly because they used a volunteer from 18 to 83 years old, and we know the elderly people are having a lot more severe consequences compared to AstraZeneca and Oxford vaccine, which have the volunteer from 18 to basically 58 years old. So all in all, this is a good start. However, there are still challenges to counteract before we can claim a vaccine become available, and that required testing in an actual field against the natural infection. That required phase 3 trial, and that's ongoing for both of these vaccines.
Mm-hmm. So what would be the naturally, say, next stage, to make sure that it's okay for regular folks to receive a vaccination?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And the results that we are seeing now, those are in healthy volunteers. So there are fundamental questions, for example, how the elderly people will behave to the immune induction by the vaccine, people with having comorbidities, children or pregnant women, and that required phase 3 trials. So once that data would become available, hopefully at the end of this year, because both of these vaccines are being tested in the countries where the infection rate is high, for example, in South Africa and Brazil. So all that data will only become available at the end of this year. So that would be the time when we will be in the position to really declare which vaccine would work better than others.
Mm-hmm. Very promising. Professor Chen Hong, as a Chinese-made vaccine against the coronavirus has, actually, this is another vaccine made by another Chinese company called Sinovac Biotech. They began their final stage of testing in Brazil. Some say it might be a game changer in the fight against the pandemic. So what do you think of that?
Well, this vaccine is certainly
a very encouraging and
Sorry,
inspiring
Professor Chen. Yeah.
News.
Yeah. Go ahead, Professor Chen.
Yes, I think this is a very inspiring and encouraging news. And I think, as far as I know, actually there have been like 250 candidate vaccines around the world that is being developed, and today it's 17 of those candidates are actually undergoing clinical trial, but obviously, of course, largely some of those candidates are still having its limitations and are still actually undergoing evaluation. But definitely, I think actually this is very encouraging news, because the Chinese-developed vaccine is being undergoing the evaluation in Brazil, and the results, the outcome has been quite encouraging. So I think actually that will definitely lead to some kind of good news, hopefully in the not too far future.
Mm-hmm. Well, another big important player here is the U.S. The U.S. government intends to pay $1.95 billion to buy 100 million doses of a COVID-19 vaccine being developed by Pfizer Incorporation and the German BioNTech if it proved safe and effective. Professor Munir, why the U.S. made such a decision, and how promising is that choice?
We shouldn't forget that U.S. government have already made arrangement for 300 million doses on AstraZeneca vaccine, and also 100 million from another vaccine producer called Novavax. So all in all, this is around 400 million doses, much more than the need of 330 million U.S. population. I think the primary motivation behind this all grabbing is really to ensure that when vaccine would become available, there is no deficit of already existing agreement for the developed countries. But that really is a threat for many developing countries, where everybody with the resourceful of countries, they are grabbing all the deals, while nothing is left for the developing country by the time it would become available. But certainly it is good for the national needs, but it is beyond the national rhetoric and policies. So that is where we certainly need national and bold decisions to really understand how we would distribute in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Chen Hong, as Professor Munir mentioned about next stage, next challenge, I would say, for the vaccination, basically for everybody in the world, is really about the fair distribution of the vaccines. So I wonder, what do you think of that? What's the best way to distribute? Mostly, remember, those countries are in the leading position. Usually, they are the more developed countries. For example, the UK, the US, Germany, France, China, in this sense. Mm-hmm. So how can they help less developed or developing countries to get those vaccines?
Well, I think actually President Xi Jinping, in his speech at the World Health Assembly in May, actually indicates very clearly that the vaccine developed by China, once successful, will be for the global public good. So that is actually a clear indication of China's willingness to share its know-how, its technology, and also the vaccine for the global good. I think this is a very important thing. Actually, we always talk about a global village, about the Earth being flat, about the humanity as a kind of like a collective community. But that actually we're now in a kind of like a crisis, and in such a kind of time of crisis, definitely we need this kind of collectivism that is actually to share and also to support each other. I think actually for the vaccine is not only the privilege of the rich man's club or the rich country's club, but this is also should be actually supportive to the less developed countries and also developing countries. In particular, those countries that are in a kind of like less privileged areas, those are actually the weaker or even weakest chains of their link. So definitely, I think actually the vaccine should be evenly distributed globally.
Yeah, getting a vaccine developed and then get it into the market are two separate things. So before we get it available on the market, what else we need to do? Professor Chen Hong.
Well, I think actually there are a lot of I think there are a lot of clinical trials that is actually very important. There is still a long way to go. So I think actually as we have been discussing, there are still a lot of limitations for those vaccines to see actual vaccine really to be taking effect and also having a lasting effect, not only within a restricted period of time, but actually for a lasting effect to develop an antibody that will actually keep the pathogen from being active. That actually is still actually a long way to go. So I'm not sure whether by the end of the year we'll be successful to develop a vaccine yet, but definitely even if that is successful, still there's still a long way to for a widespread market use of the vaccine.
Seems its availability is either at the end of this year or early next year. But let's leave it there for now and take a look at this week's NEWSMAKER. joining us now is Wu Changhua, CEO of Beijing Future Innovation Center. So according to a new study, polar bears might extinct by the end of the century as a result of a shrinking sea ice unless more is done to tackle climate change. So Changhua, how serious is the situation here?
The latest report is telling us that the situation is very, very devastating. Global warming is accelerating the melting of the Arctic sea ice, which is a habitat of polar bears, where they usually hang around and capture seals for their food. From a warming perspective, the 19 warmest years in our history happened in the last 20 years, since 2001. Last 5 years have been the warmest of the warmest, and this year, 2020, is now 72% sure will be making another record of warming. The Arctic region somehow is 3 times more warming in terms compared to the regions actually in the equator region, meaning more ice will be melting at a much accelerated rate in the Arctic region, and that threatens the habitat of the polar bears. We all know polar bears literally depend on seals for their food supply. In the past, when the ice remains, plenty, and they usually hang around on the ice all year round, or somewhere actually, if it's not all year round, they would retreat to land in the spring or summer for fasting. But now, actually, they have to fast much, much longer, and they are far away from their food supply, and the bear cubs actually have much reduced opportunity for feeding, which threatens the survival and reproduction of the polar bears. How devastating that is? There are about 25,000 polar bears today in the region, and according to studies, even in a moderate warming scenario, meaning if we manage to peak our emissions by 2040 and then decline emissions afterwards, we're still going to face a devastating future where the Arctic will be ice-free, meaning polar bears will definitely be starving to extinction. That's how devastating that's going to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, Changhua, we have been, talking about climate change for years, if not for decades. Where are we now, and what needs to be done to really reverse the situation and say, let's save the polar bears?
Well, I think 28 years passed already since the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was first adopted in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. In the last 28 years, of course, we learned more. We didn't really know enough back in 1992 that how devastating climate change will be. It will be becoming an ecological devastation, actually, in terms of the impact and the intensity. From technology perspective, we didn't have adequate accessible, affordable, renewable energy back then. But now we definitely know more, right? We have more. The Paris Agreement, we have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which provide a good framework for governments and business to reshape their strategy and set more ambitious targets. Today, more than 150 global companies have signed up to the goal of a net zero carbon future by mid-century, by 2050. What's sort of missing or deficit is political will, as reflected by the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, as well as by the hesitation on many parts of the government when elevation of the commitments to Paris Agreement.
That's the key part, the political will, from, and most important, the U.S. and other countries. So thank you, Changhua. With that, we are coming to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. I'm Xu Jinduo. Thank you for watching. See you next time.